And so we are in week 3 in our series that we're calling Ordinary Joe. We've tracked this man who started out as kind of a young boy who was the favored child of his father and lived in that sense of pride and privilege, and has now become an ordinary Joe living in exile in the nation of Egypt. Week 1, we saw the story of Joseph as 11 of 12 brothers with 10 older brothers above him that he looked up to and followed around. And one day gets this dream and has a series of back-to-back dreams in which God reveals to him that one day you will rise up and become more powerful than your brothers, that they will actually bend down and bow before you and look up to you as a respected leader. And that image that he shares with his brothers kind of flippantly, wondering how they'll respond, leads them to kind of rage and jealousy, and they sell him into slavery. And so he is sold in basically human trafficked, ends up in Egypt, and is hired or given as a servant for basically the head of the secret service, a man named Potiphar. And in that position, he actually thrives. He does great. He becomes a powerful leader and oversees all of the house and gets a taste again of maybe being a respected leader and wonders maybe this is part of what God's plan was. And just as things seem to be going well, Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him and he refuses, and then she falsely accuses him of sexual assault and he ends up in prison. And we saw last week that while he was in the depths of this federal prison, 4 times the text says the Lord was still with him. And so last week we kind of claimed this great biblical principle that pain and problems do not signal the absence of God's presence. No matter how deep the pit is or how dark the prison is, that God has been with Joseph his entire life. We said that this new reality of living as a foreigner in a country that is not your own can be described as exile. An exile is a person who has been displaced from his or her native home or culture. And that experience of exile leads to all sorts of feelings of disorientation and loss and grief and confusion. Feeling like I don't have any roots here, I don't belong here, how do I make my way? And there's a sense in which there are many forms of exile today, whether it be cultural exile or kind of metaphorical exile, but exile is also just the natural human condition. That every single man or woman was been born into a world made in the image of God, intended to be created and living in right relationship with God, our Creator, to be in intimacy with Him, to experience the same thing that Adam and Eve experienced in the Garden of Eden, where they walked with God each day. And yet because of the fall, we no longer experience that. We've been kicked out of the garden. We've been sent out into exile, and we live in a world that no longer reflects the perfection of God's kingdom. It no longer reflects the justice and beauty and righteousness and shalom that God intended. It reflects more of the kingdoms or the empires of the world that are about power and greed, consumerism, oppression and injustice. And yet there's something inside of us, especially now, those who have been reborn into the image of Christ, that feels like we don't belong here, and we're longing for God to come and remake the earth the way it will one day be, where we'll actually feel like we're back at home. But until then, we live as exiles, and we're confused by the ways of the world around us. It seems like the wicked prosper and the righteous suffer. And that's exactly what has gone on with Joseph. Last week, we saw him do the right thing. He refused the advances of this woman that was not his wife. He knew this was wrong. I can't do this. How could I sin before God and sleep with you? And yet his reward for that is to get thrown in prison. And that's often the frustration of living in exile in a broken world, is that it feels like the rules don't go according to the way we want them to be or the way that God created them. And so last week we talked a little about what's the posture that we take in exile. And we used that word incarnation, the idea of embodying the life of Jesus in the world around us. And we said incarnation is the appropriate response to exile versus assimilation, where we just go along with the way of the culture and blend in, or isolation, where we try to withdraw from the culture and maintain a sense of purity, but we have no relational credibility to impact anyone around us. And so that was the posture of exile. Today, I want to just get honest about the pain of exile. I mean, how do we handle the feelings of confusion and suffering and pain that come with living in a broken world? Because as bad as it's been for Joseph, from the pit to this prison, it's actually about to get even worse for him. And so we're going to keep our story going in Genesis chapter 40, which picks up a few years into his imprisonment. And I'll read that text there. It'll be on the screen above. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended to them. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. And when Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why do you look so sad today?" "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there is no one to interpret them." And then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. And he said to him, "In my dream, I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. And as soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, and I squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand." "This is what it means," Joseph said to him. "The 3 branches are the 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I've done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." Just as an aside, you can just kind of hear the hope in Joseph's voice. He's thinking, maybe this is my way out. God has given me this gift to interpret dreams, and I am interpreting your dream, and it's a positive interpretation, and you're going to be elevated and lifted out of here, and hey, I'm kind of scratching your back, so you scratch my back. So when you get back in the presence of Pharaoh, tell him there's this great guy who can interpret dreams, who might be helpful, and rescue me, get me out of here. Just the hope in his voice that maybe my luck is about to change. Maybe this is how God is going to work. If this cupbearer will just remember me and return the favor. When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph, "Well, I too had a dream, and on my head there were 3 baskets of bread, and in the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh. But the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head." "This is what it means," Joseph said. "The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh." Notice he doesn't say to him, "And remember me when you get into Pharaoh's presence." He's like, "You're of no help to me. You're going to be dead in 3 days, sadly." Now, sure enough, the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials, and he lifted up the heads of his chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials, and he restored the chief cupbearer to his position, so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. And then here's the punchline of this whole chapter. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Those 3 words, "he forgot him," will cost Joseph 2 more years of his life. 2 more years rotting away in this prison. Once again, an innocent victim of another person's selfishness. In many ways, this is the 3rd round of relational betrayal that he has had to experience. First, it was his brothers, and then it was this woman who betrayed him with these false accusations, and now this fellow prisoner that he serves that could have helped him and totally forgets about him. Each time, Joseph has done the right thing. He's done nothing wrong to deserve all of this, and each time it seems like his life is getting worse. And you can imagine Joseph, waiting those early days when the cupbearer goes, and he hears, the news maybe through the prison of what has happened. And yes, the cupbearer has been restored, and oh my gosh, yes, the baker was killed just like I thought, and maybe today's the day they're going to send for me. I know it probably took them a couple days to tell Pharaoh about me, but maybe next week, maybe this is the month. And days go by, and no one comes to get him. I was trying to kind of capture the essence of this, and sometimes I find it helpful to kind of bring art into teaching. And so this week I was just looking around online for artwork of Joseph alone and betrayed and dejected. And I just found this piece. It's a kind of a wood engraving. And I just love it. I just love this idea of Joseph all alone. I love that there's some light source behind him that might reflect outside, but he's not looking towards it. He's looking away from it. He's clearly cold. He's got no shoes on his feet. He's got some sort of cloak wrapped around him, and his head is just down. It's just this dejection, this loneliness. And I want to spend this morning, as maybe unpleasant as it might be, just dwelling on this emotional reality. Because pain and suffering is a shared human experience. And there have been days in all of our lives where that is a picture of maybe not our external reality, but maybe what's going on internally. And I wonder what sort of pain and suffering might even be in this room today. Or maybe it's physical pain. Maybe it's just ongoing, nagging physical issues that you're hoping to get relief and trying different doctors, and trying different medicines, trying different treatments, and it just seems like nothing helps, and every day your body reminds you of how it's failing you. Maybe it's mental suffering, depression, anxiety, struggling to get out of bed, struggling to love yourself, struggling to make healthy decisions, feeling like your own brain is betraying your spirit. Maybe it's the relational pain of being in conflict with people you love, or being out of touch with people you love because of conflict that was never resolved. Maybe it's kind of the pain that comes around personal dreams as we think about Joseph as a dreamer. The dreams that you've clung to for years that are just not coming true. That spouse, that partner you always wanted to fall in love with. The family you wanted to start that's not happening. The professional aspirations that you always imagined, where you thought you'd be at this stage in your career, and you're just so far from that and don't know how you'd ever get there. And every day, every year that goes by, it just feels like you're kind of losing hope that that will ever happen. And before taking the job that I have now with a church planting organization, I spent 20 years pastoring local churches. And I can tell you, in 20 years of pastoring, you sit with a lot of people in their pain and suffering. I can remember getting a call late at night and going over to sit with a husband and wife in their home after they had just been told that their teenage daughter had taken her life. I sat with young men who came in for counseling and said, I'm just so angry, I'm struggling, I'm an alcoholic, or my wife keeps saying, what's wrong with you? And in the privacy and confidentiality of my office, they told me for the first time in their life, when I was a child, I was molested by a female babysitter. Another one saying I was molested by a religious leader. Another one telling me that the older boys in the neighborhood sexually molested me, and I'm just so angry all the time about it. And I just keep this shame and this scars with me for years. It's crazy. Yesterday I was playing golf. Enough golf stories, I know. But yesterday I was playing golf, as I do on most Saturdays, with this young guy who's 25 years old. And, the way I view kind of my relationships with people who don't know Jesus is that I'm trying to incarnate, I'm trying to model Jesus for him, I'm trying to disciple him into the life of Jesus. And so I'm always trying to ask intentional questions. And I was thinking about my sermon, and I said to him, hey, Vic, I'm preaching on suffering tomorrow at this church where I'm teaching. I said, what's the biggest experience of suffering you've had in your life? And I'll be honest, I kind of said it a little tongue-in-cheek, like the kid's 25. How much suffering do you have at 25 in my mind, And he goes, well, I guess that would have to be 3 years ago when my older brother and best friend died of a fentanyl overdose. I was like, Vic, man, you never told me that. I had no idea. What was that like? And just to hear him recount that experience and say, I was the one who was 10 years younger. I was the one who knew that his life was heading this direction. I was the one who was the most afraid that fentanyl was going to get mixed with his drugs and kill him. And I was the one who was always trying to help him. And he was always kind of like, yeah. And then he died. And just the guilt that he carries. One of the most powerful books on suffering I've ever read is by a man named Viktor Frankl. It's called Man's Search for Meaning. And if you're not familiar with Viktor Frankl, he was a Swiss psychologist who was taken away into Nazi concentration camps during World War II, spent 3 years there. And during those years, he lost his parents, his brother, and his pregnant wife, who were all killed. But somehow he survived. And when he got out, he wrote this book about his own experience of suffering. And one of the things that he says, that almost kind of this image or picture of suffering that always sticks with me is this. He says, suffering is similar to the behavior of gas. it will fill a chamber evenly and completely, no matter how big the chamber. Thus, suffering completely fills the human soul and conscious mind, no matter whether the suffering is great or little. There's a sense in which there's no point in comparing sufferings, because when you are suffering, when you're in pain, that suffering and pain fills every inch of your body, like a gas filling a room, that there's not any space, it feels like, that isn't overcome by grief and loss. It takes over your thoughts, it takes over your emotions, it takes away sleep. And part of what makes, I think, pain and suffering so challenging in the modern Christian life is that many of us as Christians are not kind of theologically equipped to know how to process those experiences. I mean, Western society's kind of highest goal through commercialism and consumerism is to basically prevent suffering or eliminate it, or to offer you a product that will numb the pain of any suffering that you're going through. And in many ways, the Western church is kind of assimilated into that. I mean, I even saw it yesterday. There's that awkward moment when you're on a golf course in kind of a recreational setting with a friend, and you ask him about suffering, and then he mentions it, and then there's this awkwardness of like, oh, crap, just ruined the mood. Now we're talking about suffering. And how much do I ask him about this? Does he want to talk about it? Do I want to talk about it? We're out here having a good time. And there's almost this pressure to kind of sweep it on the rug and, hey, let's get back, and almost kind of make a joke. And next thing you know, we're not talking about it anymore. And sure enough, within a hole, the conversation had passed and we never came back to it. And I think as Christians, we can easily kind of buy into this cultural lie and believe that the purpose of our faith is to help us avoid the pain of living in a fallen world. And the dominant drive of Western Christianity, I think in the last 100 years especially, has gone from the pursuit of Jesus in order to experience holiness to the pursuit of Jesus in order to experience happiness. It's almost like Jesus is offered evangelistically. He's even offered to people as if he's a product. Donald Miller had a great phrase where he calls it infomercial Jesus. Have you ever heard an infomercial Jesus presentation? You know, a good infomercial where it's black and white. You know, the woman's in the kitchen. She's got the dull knife and she cuts her hand and she's folding this tomato because it won't slice. And she's, this knife sucks, you know. And then all of a sudden the glitzy, glamorous product comes out and now the world is in color and she has a super sharp knife and she's cutting tomatoes and tin cans and boots. And, you know, life is all different and better with this amazing new product. And this solves everything. And now you can have all of your kitchen problems solved for 3 easy payments of $19.99. That's the power of the infomercial. Have you ever heard Jesus offered that way? Your life may suck and you may be down, you may be miserable, but I can tell you there's a Jesus. And if you give your life to Jesus, you can have everything you want. And you can be rich and powerful and happy and have no problems left for 3. It's not even payments, it's free. You can have it right now. That's not the biblical picture of Jesus, and it's definitely not the biblical story of Joseph. About 20 years ago, an author named Christian Smith kind of identified this trend in the American religious mindset of offering a different version of faith than had ever been offered in the Christian world, and he called it moralistic therapeutic deism. You may have heard this phrase, but he basically characterized in his studies, he said most Christian youth believe basically 2 core principles in their faith. 1, God does not need to be particularly involved in one's life, except when God is needed to resolve a problem. God, you stay over there, I got it, but if something bad happens, I'll come to you, and then we can connect. And then the second premise was that the central goal of life is to be happy and feel good about oneself. And so faith's real purpose is solve problems and alleviate pain and suffering. And he said there's a whole generation growing up that this is kind of the essence of their spiritual life. But that version of faith is not resilient enough when suffering comes. When you're metaphorically sitting in a prison like that and you feel in despair, if you're only following Jesus for what he'll do for you, that'll shipwreck your faith. Jesus is not going to save you from suffering in life. And we need to recover kind of a historical Christian worldview that said, traditionally people understood suffering was a result of evil. And the evil was wrong. The evil should be addressed and eliminated. But the suffering actually sometimes had value. It was something to be leaned into. It was something to be embraced. That suffering had redemptive purposes in the lives of individuals. It wasn't something that we tried to ignore. And that there was a response, a pathway through suffering. And that's what I want to look at today is what do God's people do in the midst of our suffering and exile? Now, sadly, for all this information we have about Joseph, we don't have a lot of information about kind of his prayer life or what he's saying to God in the midst of this. But I really believe that Joseph, as someone who's going to faithfully walk with God through this whole journey, is going to do in his suffering exactly what we'll see the nation of Israel do in their suffering when they go into exile later. Because later, years later, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar will breach the walls of Jerusalem. He'll sack the city. He'll destroy the temple and carry off all of God's people into Babylonian exile. And that destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, that will, in the Old Testament, be the apex of suffering for God's people. And will cause them to be in the depths of despair. And in the midst of that despair, a prophet named Jeremiah will begin to put words to the experience of all the Jewish people in suffering. And he will write a book called Lamentations. And Lamentations is just a book of laments. A lament is a passionate expression of sorrow or suffering. Lament is the language we use to express the reality of our pain and suffering. We lament because things are not as we long for them to be with God in control. And so here are just a few quotes from the book of Lamentations, from Jeremiah pouring out his heart about the fall of Jerusalem and the exile of God's people. Here's what he says. He says, "How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow she is, who once was great among the nations. She who was queen amongst the provinces has now become a slave. Bitterly she weeps at night. Tears are on her cheeks. All of her friends have betrayed her. They have become her enemies. After affliction and harsh labor, Judah has gone into exile. This is why I weep and my eyes overflow with tears. No one is near to comfort me. No one to restore my spirit. My eyes fail from weeping. I am in torment within. My heart is poured out on the ground. The hearts of the people cry out to the Lord." I mean, Jeremiah, representing the collective of the city and then his own individual experience, is trying to pour out his heart on behalf of himself and representing the entire nation and saying, God, we are in agony right now. We have lost so much. He's not ignoring his pain. He's not trying to medicate his pain or numb his pain or buy something to distract him from his pain. He's acknowledging it. He's facing it, and he's bringing it to God. And God calls us to lament pain and suffering because paradoxically, the cure for our pain is in our engagement of it. Lament forces us to take our pain and bring it to God. And if we don't enter that pit of suffering completely and fully, and if we don't experience the depths of anguish and pain, and if we don't put into words even messy, accusatory, cursing words if we need them, if we don't do all of that, then we truly can't come out the other side with any sense of peace and joy. But lament is not limited to the book of Lamentations. There are dozens of psalms of lament. In fact, you know that of the 150 psalms, 40% of them are sad songs of lament. I wonder in American churches this morning that are gathering, is it possible that 40% of the worship songs that are being sung are sad songs? I don't think so. We sing happy songs. That seems like that's the cultural tone that we've fallen into, is keep it all positive, keep faith upbeat. But the reality is that the songbook of the Old Testament, 40% of them are songs that are sad. Psalm 13 laments the general suffering that we experience in a broken world, feeling forgotten and ignored by God. Psalm 13 laments the pain of God not doing as much as he could to fix my circumstances. Psalm 55 specifically laments the suffering that comes at the hands of others, those who betray us, including a close friend. Psalm 82 laments the unjust suffering of the poor and the weak and the oppressed, and says to the audience, even if you're not experiencing suffering, part of the call of God's people is to stand in empathy with those who are experiencing suffering. So let's lament on behalf of the poor and the weak and the oppressed and the marginalized who are suffering right now, and not be alone and think that we are protected. We are all part of a community. And then one of the most famous psalms of lament is Psalm 51, where David, after his sin with Bathsheba, laments not the external brokenness of the world around him, but the brokenness within him. He laments that I am broken, that I am a mess, that I have caused pain and suffering in the lives of myself and others around me. I'm the problem that he's lamenting to God. And all of these songs of lament, I mean, it's some of the most unguarded, honest, rash, abrasive language that's ever used in the Bible, and it's all directed at God. It's really a credit to the nation of Israel that over the course of their years, that they had this songbook that they didn't go back and go, wait, what did David say? We can't have that. No. We can't let our grandkids think you can talk to God like that. Let's just eliminate that Psalm of Lament, and let's cut this book down, make it a little happier and upbeat. And they're like, no, you want to know what the human experience is like? It's this. It's cursing at God in your frustration. It's crying out. It's staying up all night. Yeah, that's part of the human experience. Our grandkids need to know that, and they need to know that God is big enough to handle all those emotions. And so they keep it in there, and we even have it today. And in all these Psalms of Lament, there's a pattern. And I love that there's a pattern to these Psalms, because it's almost like life is chaotic, it's out of control, nothing makes sense. How do I impose some sort of structure? Okay, well, there's a pattern to my prayer life that I can bring, and at least I can cling to that structure. And that pattern is 3 parts. It's protest, it's plea, and it's praise. All of these Psalms start with a protest, just a raw, honest expression to God of how much pain I'm in. It's like the author is just kind of spewing out all of their frustration, no filter. They just get it all out until they've cried the last tear, they've yelled till their voice is hoarse, and they've got nothing left. It's all out. There's nothing pent up. And finally, they're exhausted, and it's like, all right, now that I got all that off my chest, God, now I can acknowledge that in the past you have been good to me, and maybe you will do things for me, and so now I'm going to ask you to act. And we go from protest to plea, where it's this idea of, God, please help me. The author asks God to intervene, take action, rescue me, do something for me. Don't forget me. Don't turn your face from me. And then after that plea section, finally, each psalm ends in praise. Incredibly, there's a statement of that affirms that, God, I'm so upset and I'm so much pain and I need you to act, but even if you don't, I will still worship you. Even if you don't do what I need you to do, I will still cling to the fact that you are good. And honestly, just getting all of this off my chest and out is helping me gain a little sense of perspective in your goodness. And you know what, God? I choose to trust. I choose to believe in you by faith. It's a protest, a plea, and then a praise. There's a professor at Fuller named Soong-Chung Rah who writes a lot about lament, and he has a great book called Prophetic Lament, and he says this about the Psalms. He says, the Psalms of Lament are a wonderful resource to help us pray through suffering. They give us both the permission to lament and also the tools through which we can articulate our pain. They give us a way of dealing with strong negative emotions. Catch this, with which neither repress them, our emotions, which is harmful to us, or vents them on others, which is destructive to them. Lament enables us to put our negative emotions onto God rather than cause us psychological damage or others hurt. I remember the first time I read that going like, oh my gosh, you just perfectly caught what I tend to do in my strong emotion. I tend to not go to God with it. I tend to either stuff it and then it causes me damage, or I tend to blow and react at somebody else and cause them harm. And he's like, the whole purpose of lament is to protect yourself and protect others. It's as if God's like, don't put this on yourself and don't put it on others. You know who's big enough to take your lament? Me. Bring it to me. What do you want to say? I can handle it. Lament is an invitation to go towards God. He finishes this by saying, through the way they are expressed, the Psalms of Lament help turn the sufferer towards God, not away from him. They enable a person to articulate their experience and to engage with God. God has broad shoulders, and he can take our doubt and our questions and even our cries for vengeance. So back to today, what do we do in this culture today that often encourages us to dismiss our suffering? Or honestly, when we're experiencing suffering, to not feel like we can share it with others, to be embarrassed by it. Nobody wants to be a Debbie Downer. Nobody wants to go around all the time talking about their problems. Man, you won't get invited to any parties, you act like that. I mean, that's the culture we kind of live in. And so what happens is a person who's suffering, not only is suffering, but now they feel the pressure to have to deny my suffering and censor my thoughts and kind of numb out so that I don't impact or influence others. Because the goal is just to get back into the normal swing of society and be happy again. But the church needs to be different. That's the way of the world, but that is not the way the church is supposed to be. This is supposed to be a place of honesty where there's room And this call to lament is an invitation for us as a community to slow down, to sit with our suffering, and even find some meaning in it. And to realize that suffering does not have to be destructive to the soul. In fact, one of the great promises of Scripture is that suffering is not destructive. It has the power to be creative. Suffering can create good things. The reason we lament is because lament ultimately has creative value. And if you don't believe me, then you don't understand the message of the gospel. Because the suffering of Jesus Christ on the cross creates the greatest gift the world can ever receive. There is no salvation, there is no redemption without Jesus suffering. The Jesus who could have said, no, I don't suffer, I'm all powerful, I can do what I want. The Jesus that I can call down 1,000 angels if I want to right now. I can jump down off this cross if I want to. But the Jesus who engaged and embraced suffering. And while he's on the cross, is crying out in Psalms of lament, my God, why have you forsaken me? He's quoting the Old Testament songs. He's teaching us how to suffer well. Jesus is both a sovereign and suffering God. And it's through the suffering of God that the suffering of humanity will eventually be overcome. And so the power for us as followers of Jesus is not that because we love Jesus, we don't have to suffer. It's that because we love Jesus, we have someone who is with us in our suffering. We never need to suffer alone. Jesus suffered. Isaiah 53 says he was a man who was despised and rejected, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. That's who we draw near to in our suffering. Not someone who doesn't understand it, but someone who goes, I know exactly what you're going through. I was betrayed. I was physically beaten. I was all alone. And because of the cross, no one needs to suffer alone. And that becomes then the difference. That's what we're incarnating in the world, is not a problem-free, suffering-free life, saying, hey, if you just come follow Jesus and buy into the infomercial version of Jesus, then all of your problems will go away. No. What we're saying is life is gonna suck until Jesus remakes it. But in the midst of that sucking and suffering, you don't have to go through it alone. Jesus draws near to you, and our community as the body of Christ wants to draw near to you so you don't have to be alone, and just get it out. Tell us what you're feeling. In fact, the book of Hebrews says that Jesus became like humans in his suffering so that we can become like Jesus in our suffering. And that's part of the creative force of suffering, is it refines us. Romans 5 says, we glory in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces endurance, and endurance character, and character produces hope. I'm going to invite the band to come up just as we close. And as Joseph is rotting away in this prison, we don't know exactly what words he's using. But the biblical pattern of people of faith is that he is lamenting to God, and that his character is being shaped by his suffering, so that soon, as we'll see next week, when he is finally rescued out of this pit, he is a man who ultimately is not worshiping the empire, but he is faithful to worship God. That by worshiping God in the pit and worshiping God in the prison, he will continue to worship God in the palace next week. But to be shaped by suffering, we have to submit to it. We have to engage it. We have to lament. Because paradoxically, the cure for life's greatest pain is in our engagement in it, not our avoidance of it. And so if you're suffering this week, and I'm sure many of us are, with some level of grief or loss or pain or sadness, maybe it's personal, maybe it's communal, maybe you're even called to empathize with the suffering you see in the city around us, I invite you to just write your own prayer of lament. It's a simple way to do that. Take a journal or just take a piece of paper and kind of fold it 3 ways and put those 3 headings on the top. Protest, plea, praise. And just pour out your heart to God in protest. Name the losses. Name what you're feeling about those losses. Be raw, be honest, don't sugarcoat it. God's got broad shoulders, he can take it. And then once you get all of that out, dream scenario, God, how would I want you to intervene? Please, God, do this on my behalf. This is what I long for. And then the third part, and yet, God, even if you don't, I will still praise you. Write down what will be true of God regardless of what he does. One of the things that I wrote even this week as I was writing this was in my praise section was that one day in the age to come, all that is broken will be restored. And all the things that I was writing in my please section, they do come true. It just may not be on this side of heaven. And I cling to that promise. God's inviting us to lament to him even today. Let's take this time of reflection, think about what the Lord might be speaking to us personally, what he might be inviting us to do, and even how we might engage in this ancient liturgical practice that draws us closer to God in our suffering.